In this video, I will present our paper titled Exploring Distributional Shifts in Large Language Models for Code Analysis that was accepted to make conference proceedings of EMNLP 2023. The motivation for this work has been introduced a few decades ago. Back then, researchers have noticed that a statistical learning system trained on one software project would perform quite well on that project, however, it would lend itself very poorly to other projects. The slide researcher attempting to identify the causes of such poor transferability, as well as finding features that would guarantee better performance in new projects. Today, we no longer train models on a single project or a single code base, but rather use large combinations of projects. Additionally, the models we train are not simple statistical models either. The size of the models trained today was inconceivable some 10 years ago. Most importantly, the resulting models are being deployed everywhere, which leads us to asking whether the same challenges with lack of transferability across software code bases still exist. For this project, we used JavaScript portion of CodeSearchNet dataset. We wanted to compare transferability across companies, across systems, and across individual components of a system. CodeSearchNet dataset is collected from GitHub, so in our experiments, companies corresponded to GitHub repository owners, systems corresponded to GitHub repositories, and components corresponded to folders inside the repository. We grouped the code snippets in three ways. Firstly, we grouped them by their repositories, meaning code snippets from the same repository ended up in the same group. We similarly grouped them by their belonging to the same company or the same folder. As a result, we were left with this many groups of organizations, repositories, and folders correspondingly, many of which, however, contained very few code snippets each. After filtering those out, we end up with at least 100 groups in the training portion and from 8 to 15 in the testing portion. We conducted our experiments by using one group from testing portion at a time as our target domain, and we compared it against using training data, which does not contain any samples from our target domain. We used some data from each of those to perform domain adaptation on two instances of the model. The resulting adapted models were both tested on the remaining data from the target domain. The model that has not been trained on any data from the target domain is encountering the domain for the first time, so we refer to its performance as out-of-domain or OD performance. On the other hand, the model that has encountered some data from the target domain during the domain adaptation stage will be reflective of the model's in-domain performance, or ID, for the target domain. In our experiments, we used two large language models, Code'25 and Codex. For Code'25, our adaptation consists of fine-tuning, during which we update model parameters. Codex is a much larger closed-source model, and thus parameter update for it is not possible. However, because of its larger size, it can be made to follow instructions. Another ability that Codex as a larger model possesses is learning in context. In our experiments, we used up to 8 in-context demonstrations due to input length limitation of the Codex model. Both approaches for domain adaptation will be adapted on ID data from target domain as well as some random OD data to make sure models encounter the same amount of supervision data. First, let's look at ID and OD model performance on code summarization, which is evaluated with Blue metric. We see that Code'25 model performance changes 2 to 3 times after it has been adapted on just a few examples from the target domain. This plot illustrates the change for just 16 examples. For Codex, we see that its performance with only instructions and no in-context learning is pretty poor. Adding OD in-context examples improves its performance by a lot. However, we see an even more drastic change in performance after adding in-domain in-context examples. Now for code generation, the metric we use is CodeBlue, which is a modification of Blue metric. For Code'25, here again, we see there is an improvement in performance after introducing ID domain adaptation, though admittedly a more modest one. What about Codex? For code generation, we also notice that in-context examples, even out-of-domain ones, can seriously improve the performance of the model. However, as before, we see that the addition of in-domain in-context examples boosts performance even further. As a result, we can conclude that both models demonstrated decreased performance when encountering a previously unseen target domain, regardless of whether this unseen domain was a folder, repository, or a new organization. Based on these results, we wanted to test some approaches that could help with out-of-domain generalization. For Code'25, we considered different training strategies that could help with OD generalization. First of all is multitask learning, where we train the model for the application at hand, for example, code generation or code summarization, on multiple domains at once. The second one is dual generation multitask learning, where we train the model to perform both code summarization and code generation at once. And the final one is meta-learning, in particular the model-agnostic meta-learning algorithm, or MAML. The goal of meta-learning is training models that can quickly learn and generalize to new tasks, or in our case, new domains. We did not employ any training strategies for Codex since it is closed source, but in addition to training, we also considered a different approach for domain adaptation. We considered using strategically chosen out-of-domain instances instead of randomly chosen ones. For Code'23, for each target domain, we retrieved instances from training data that were most similar to the target domain test examples. We retrieved either 4, 8, or 32 such examples per test instance, combined them into a new set, deduplicated it, and used it instead of OD data to fine-tune the model. For Codex, we skipped the step where we combined the retrieved examples into a single set and used the most similar retrieved examples as is with in-context learning. Let's look at the results for Code'23 first. Here we present 3 versions of Code'23 models trained differently in multitask fashion, dual generation multitask fashion, and using meta-learning. For code summarization, we are comparing the performance of the models right after training, labeled 0-shot on the plots, with the performance obtained after additional adaptation on the target domain, labeled 8-shot on the plots. These scenarios correspond to trained models' OD and ID performances. We see that despite the discrepancy in performance growing smaller, it is still present in every training strategy we used. On the other side, we also see that using retrieved examples for domain adaptation can provide better results, either reducing the performance gap significantly or even performing on par with ID domain adaptation. Now let's consider the results for Codex. First, let's look at code summarization. The blue bars show the results we saw before with in-context learning ID and OD performance, and the red bar is the model performance using in-context learning with the retrieved examples. Again, we notice that retrieving examples for in-context demonstrations closes the difference between OD and ID performance. Similar picture is observed for code generation. To summarize the findings of this work, we saw that the number of splits that occur naturally in software present models for code processing with distributional shift challenge. We also saw that domain adaptation in these scenarios can be effective with a very small amount of data. In our experiments, we were using just 8, 16, or 32 in-domain instances for domain adaptation. Finally, we saw that retrieving similar examples from training data for the purpose of supervision can be effective in combating this distributional shift. I invite you to refer to the paper for more experimental results and additional details.